Kenneth and Waltz was one of the preeminent theorists of international relations in the past half century or more. He started his career at Columbia and finished it here in the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. And this annual lecture is named in his honor. And previous Waltz Memorial lecturers have included protégés of Ken and people who have disagreed with him, but all important theorists of international relations in one way or another. So today, John Ruggie will give us his views on how Waltz's theory does in assessing current shifts in the global balances of public and private power. John Gerard Ruggie is the Berthold Beitz Professor in Human Rights and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, an affiliated professor in international legal studies at Harvard Law. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, winner of numerous awards, and the policy impact of his work has been recognized by the ASK Prize and the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin and the American Bar Association and the Washington Foreign Law Society. He served UN Secretary General Kofi Annan as Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning, overseeing the creation of the UN Global Compact and introducing the Millennium Development Goals, as well as leading Annan's institutional reform efforts and working with the US government. From 2005 to 2011, he served as Special Representative of the Secretary General for Business and Human Rights, producing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, adopted unanimously by the Human Rights Council, and which constitute the first global standard in this policy space. He wrote a book reflecting on that experience, Just Business, Multinational Corporations and Human Rights, and an earlier book, Constructing the World Polity, contributed to the development of the social constructivist approach to the study of international relations. John?
Thank you. Well, don't applaud yet. Very nice to be back here at SIPA, where I taught and I was dean. I was lured away from the deanship by Kofi Annan, who asked me to come and take a job with him after he was elected. Shortly thereafter, I actually came back to SIPA to give a lecture. And I walked in on the main floor, got in the elevator, and there was a young woman in the elevator with me who kept sort of throwing glances at me. And we stopped on several floors, but we finally got up to the 15th floor where I was going to give my lecture. And as we got off the elevator, she said, "Excuse me, sir, didn't you used to be somebody?" Here I am again. I'm really very pleased. Ken Waltz and I were good friends, as well as colleagues. We arrived at Berkeley as faculty members at the same time. He had an endowed chair, and as I recall, I was an acting assistant professor, and you don't get any lower than acting as an assistant professor. But as Dick said, Ken was certainly one of the preeminent theorists of international relations, international politics over the course of the last half century or so. And I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to honor him by trying to use some of his thoughts to reflect on where we are in the world today. But in case you're not intimately familiar with Ken, I think I'll start with a sort of a brief overview of his work and indicate what made it so important. He wrote two classic books, as I'm sure you know, Man, the State, and War, and In Theory of International Politics. Man, the State, and War, elegantly written, beautifully written, essentially argued that war is not a function of flaws in human nature, or the existence of bad states, but it's a function of the system within which all states operate, which he called anarchy. It's an anarchic system. Anarchy does not mean chaos, it means the absence of central rule. And for Waltz, the absence of central rule was the driver of his theory. In theory of international politics, he sort of formalized that understanding and reflected on the conditions under which stability or conflict will prevail. The basic model was quite straightforward. The condition of anarchy, he argued, imposes self-help on countries. If there is no one that can guarantee that they will take care of you, you better look after yourself. If no one is entitled to rule and no one is entitled to obey, you better take care of yourself and make sure that you don't get into trouble. He used the famous stag and hare parable in Man, the State, and War to illustrate the point. So you may know there's 5 hungry individuals cooperate to trap a stag, and when a hare comes into sight, one of them defects, satisfies his own hunger, and leaves the others with nothing but food for thought. And that's how the world works, basically. Now, Waltz did not rule out collaboration, which is a good thing because otherwise I would feel totally irrelevant, because that's one of the things that I've studied in my career. He didn't leave it out, but I think he was right, actually, when he said that collaboration is a means by which states pursue their interests, right? It isn't for the sake of collaborating. It isn't even necessarily for the end that you want to achieve. It's a means rather than an ends-driven process. So the international system, in some sense, he viewed as analogous to a market, driven by self-regarding units. And the system itself was sort of a byproduct of the interaction of units, self-regarding units. And in a market, we look at the structure of the market depending upon the concentration of power. So you have monopoly, duopoly, oligopoly, etc. And you find out the structure of the international political system by counting the number of great powers. Okay? So if we have greater concentration of power, in the absence of central rule, the most stable situation that you could imagine would be bipolarity. And that was the reality that I think sort of drove much of Ken's thinking. Now, he analyzed, in theory of international politics, what he called three international orders: the security order, the economic order, and something he called managing global problems. So in the security sphere, states have two means at their disposal to self-help, as it were. One is domestic, try to develop better strategies, build up your capacities, and so on and so forth. The other is external, undermine your enemy's allies or alliances and try to strengthen your own. That was sort of the situation in the security sphere. And short of universal empire, bipolarity will give you the greatest amount of stability. In the economic order, likewise, Ken felt that it was also driven by self-help. Domestically, the domestic order is capable of acting in its own good. Why? Because there is central rule. It doesn't always act in its own good. And I think, never mind. But it's capable of acting in its own good, right? And so Kansas can grow wheat, Detroit can make cars, neither feels vulnerable as a result of depending on the other for vehicles or food, and the collectivity as a whole benefits from that division of labor. Internationally, we don't have much of a division of labor because of self-help. Everybody tries to do as much as they can for themselves. Economic interdependence is typically a marginal affair, and it's more likely to be marginal if the system is dominated by a few great powers with large domestic economies. That was the model. And in managing global problems, like the environment, again, it's the same situation, except described with different words. It's the tyranny of small decisions. Nobody acts on behalf of the system. They act in their own behalf. So problems abound at the global level, but decisions regarding what to do about them stay with the self-regarding units. And they have to figure out some way of collaborating, which in turn is constrained by the anarchic or competitive international system. And so the wonderful quote that I've used often when I'm arguing with NGOs about human rights treaties, for example. He said, "A strong sense of peril and doom may lead to a clear definition of the ends that must be achieved, but their achievement is not thereby made possible. Necessities do not create opportunities." That's pretty powerful stuff. And so as a result, global public goods inevitably are underproduced, even when all agree that more may be necessary. And the only way to get out of this situation would be to have a surrogate for government. But that surrogate for government can only be the self-regarding units, because they would never create a common government. And given that, another wonderful sentence, small is beautiful, and smaller is more beautiful than small. Okay, so let's step back and see how this helps us to understand the multi-level and high-velocity changes in the international system today, and go through the same three orders that Waltz analyzed. So, in the security order, Theory of International Politics was published in 1979, and Waltz argued in it that bipolarity was robust. Bipolarity disappeared not long thereafter, but we had a hegemonic moment, which was smaller than small. And so, presumably, a good thing. Now, what would Ken make of things today? Knowing him, I suspect that he might agree with Yanan Ganesh, who's a columnist for the Financial Times, who wrote a column recently in which he said that when you strip away the unique peculiarities of President Trump, his foreign policy amounts to, and I quote, "the restoration of the US as a selfish state among selfish states, not an overworked governess with the entire free world as her muling wards." Now, Ganesh is highly critical of how President Trump is going about this imputed aim, and I suspect that Waltz would agree with him on both counts. So Waltz opposed the wars that, many of the wars that the US has fought in recent decades, beginning with Vietnam. He thought they were unnecessary, and rather than strengthening the United States, it weakened the United States. Now, in the long run, a shift in the global balance of state power was inevitable. Some shift was inevitable. At the end of World War II, the United States possessed 2/3 of the world's monetary gold. It accounted for 1/3 of world output, and our military was miles and miles and miles beyond anyone else's for the foreseeable future. Even the notion of bipolarity existed largely because of the Soviet nuclear capabilities, not because of their economy or any other such. And the nuclear capabilities ensured mutually assured destruction. Those capabilities still existed, by the way, when the Soviet Empire collapsed and the Soviet Union itself went out of existence. Waltz is not the only person who has unsuccessfully struggled with that conundrum. If nuclear weapons made bipolarity and you still had nuclear weapons when it all collapsed, what happened? So the bottom line, in my view, is that Waltz certainly got the anarchic or the dynamics of superpower rivalry right, the overall pattern in security politics, and there were zigs and zags that he missed, but he had a wonderful line of defense, which is absolutely correct, and I've used it myself. He said, in stressing the limits of theory of any kind, he said that the universal law of gravitation cannot predict the wayward fall of a leaf in the wind. And many of the things that are happening today may fall into that wayward leaf category, including, one hopes, the 2016 presidential election. That it is not a structural phenomenon. But some of Ken's misses were foundational, and I think the most important was the following, and this is a counterfactual. Imagine what the world would have looked like if Nazi Germany had won the war. Would we be lamenting the decline of a liberal, rules-based international order today? I don't think so. Anything that we knew about how the Nazis planned to organize the world, whether in military terms as an empire or in economic terms through the bilateralist treaty arrangements and special monetary arrangements they had with dependent countries, I suspect would have been projected globally. And yet there's no reference to that foundational element of the liberal international order in Ken Waltz. It's all states with a hard shell balancing power in an external sense. Now, I've said this elsewhere. I believe that the determinative factor in constructing the post-World War II international order was not American hegemony. It was American hegemony. And any other hegemony would have been very, very different. And yet there's no way to capture that element in Waltz's theory, because anything that was related to domestic things or values, or norms, constitutional practices, that was all part of process. It's not the system. And so it was banished from the theory. Now, the economic order, next. I've noted that Ken considered international economic interdependence to be a marginal affair. especially when the system is dominated by a limited number of great powers. He measured economic interdependence by the relative size of external versus internal economic activity. And so in a paper which was entitled The Myth of International Interdependence, he showed correctly that international trade and investment as a proportion of GDP did not reach late 19th century levels until well into the 1960s and 70s. And say, see, interdependence is marginal. So what's new, he asked. Well, what was new was that was exactly the moment when the most significant economic transformation in post-war history took place, or started. Now, it would be unfair to criticize Ken for not foreseeing it, but it is fair to say that there is nothing in his theoretical framework that would help us explain it even after the fact. And the enabling conditions involve deliberate policy choices of states. So the ultimate result of this transformation, in my view, was the emergence of a global institutional form that is not derivative of sovereignty, like the UN or the World Trade Organization are derivative of state sovereignty, nor does it look like or is it based on the same kind of foundation as civil society, which acts transnationally by the grace of governments. The new global institutional form rests on the foundation of universally recognized property rights and the private law of contracts. And at its center is the multinational corporation, not as an actor in a narrow sense, but as the institutional expression of the foundation of private property rights and the private law of contracts raised to the global level. Now, in Waltz's work, non-state actors were important only to the extent that they posed, that they were sort of potentially institutionally substitutable for the state. Is this actor capable of replacing the state? If not, it was of no interest to the theory. The idea that you could have multiple actors of fundamentally different sorts was not investigated. He considered them strictly process and, as he put it, not at all productive of the system. Now, international financial transactions and companies that operate across borders have existed for a very long time. But something different began to emerge, in my view, in the 1970s, and it really took root in the 1990s. In the financial sphere, digitalization and financial engineering magnified that sphere and has real-time effects, the likes of which we have not seen before, including the frequency of international financial crises. Equally, foundational shifts have taken place in the area of production and trade. Production itself has globalized. We have global production platforms. It's not any longer one country trading products with another country. It's one company trading with itself or with contractual partners across 110 countries. So the dean may disagree with this, but I don't think we live in the world of international trade anymore. We live in a world of related party trade. And of course, states can influence that, but and Donald Trump is testing this hypothesis, it would be hard to unravel. Why? Well, roughly 80% of world trade today in terms of gross exports is linked to the production networks of multinational corporations. That's extraordinary. Trade in intermediate products is larger than all non-oil traded goods combined. Looking at any global supply chain, you know, my iPhone, it's over there, was produced by 785 suppliers in 31 countries, and that's a small supply chain. Unilever has, the consumer products company, has 70,000 first-tier suppliers, never mind going down the chain. And it procures through various contractual arrangements products from 1.5 million smallholder farmers around the world. 1 out of 7 jobs globally is supply chain related. 1 out of 5 in the G20. That doesn't count informal or so-called non-standard forms of work. Multinationals often book deals in offshore tax havens, of which there are now more than 50, as opposed to a handful just a few decades ago. The rapid increase is due to what one author describes as, quote, the commercialization of sovereignty by states who view this as their comparative advantage in the world. Tax havens, of course, facilitate corporate tax avoidance and transfer pricing. Larry Summers, my colleague at Harvard, former Treasury Secretary, and once a vigorous advocate of financial globalization, is shocked by this. And he has said so in op-eds in the Financial Times. He says, this is a significant problem for the revenue capacity of states and an immense problem for their capacity to maintain progressive taxation. So the supply chains of multinationals have, as it were, delocalized commercial transactions. But to a certain extent, they have also delocalized related lawmaking and international arbitration through what amounts to essentially private international arbitration that's legally enforceable against states. It's all part of the lex mercatoria that has been established in the last 30 years. And yet, at the same time, with only limited exception, there is no single body of law that covers the multinational corporation. Why? Because every entity is considered a separate legal personality, and each has limited liability for the actions of anybody else. That is, they're liable only to the extent of their investment in a subsidiary or an affiliate. Now, political scientists have speculated for a long time whether such developments imply the demise of the state. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But what it does mean, in my view, is the state system now shares the stage with another global institutional system, which has created forms of economic interdependence of a sort previously unknown. I have this wonderful example I want to share with you. Disney built a Magic Kingdom in Shanghai. Disney had to give the government a stake in the resort and in the management company that runs the resort. The Chinese, in return, promised legally, contractually, special protections from intellectual property piracy, which is well known in China. In the end, when all of this was said and done, Disney CEO Robert Iger described the arrangement as, quote, authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese. And that's the model that I'm trying to describe here. Authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese. Now, the Disney example illustrates the obvious point that states have authority in dealing with multinationals. They had to share the keys to the Magic Kingdom with China. But it also illustrates a second point, the interplay between two different foundations of global authority. One is rooted in sovereignty, and the other, as I've said, is rooted in property rights and the private law of contracts. Neither supplants the other, they coexist. Authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese. And the power of each, in some measure, is constrained by the authority of the other. So, China, who would have thought? It lacks the domestic liberal political culture related to property rights and the law of contracts and so on and so forth. But China discovered that it has to recognize that transnational authority structure in order to participate in and benefit very nicely from the international economy. In fact, China is now the third largest home base of multinationals after the United States and the European Union. And just last week, Ecuador-led negotiations took place in Geneva on a treaty to regulate multinational corporations under international human rights law. All of the OECD countries boycotted. It was left to China to defend transnational corporations, which they did clause after clause of the draft treaty. This is a revolution, but it's not the one that Mao expected, nor is it the one that Ken Waltz expected or would have expected. Okay, so managing global problems. He's hugely right on that front. It is constrained by the tyranny of small decisions, just as he argued. So, for example, in 1970, OECD members promised to commit 0.7 of their GDP to foreign aid. Only 6 countries have ever reached that target, and as you would expect, they're the Scandinavians, the Dutch, and occasionally the Brits. The core budgets of the UN and its agencies have been flatlined in real terms for a couple of decades. No UN peacekeeping mission in decades has had adequate capacity in personnel or material. The Gates Foundation spends more money on global public health than the World Health Organization. Why? Because that's how governments want it. Not that they wouldn't want better public health, but remember the tyranny of small decisions. I think Waltz had it right on that. In, I think, all of our judgments, I would think no instance of a tyranny of small decisions today is as consequential as the lack of effective action to combat climate change. Kyoto left out emerging emitters and therefore was unacceptable. The Paris Agreement rests on national pledges, which are not legally binding, coupled with a periodic review process which relies on self-reporting. Even if every country delivered on what it promised to deliver under Paris, we still wouldn't meet the target of temperature increase of 2% Celsius. But I do want to add that while private initiatives are no substitute for effective public policy, private initiatives, I think, as a result of the dysfunctionality of public authority is playing an ever greater role. When President Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, two major domestic coalitions sprang to life. One is We're Still In, and the other is America's Pledge. They comprise governors, mayors, county executives, business leaders, investors, environmental groups, universities, and faith-based organizations. And their mission is to advocate for and report on subnational emissions reductions in the United States, consistent with Paris goals. And the organizations involved in these initiatives, which are heavily funded by Mr. Bloomberg, claim to represent a constituency of more than half of the American public, which is impressive. Individual companies have adopted emission reduction standards for themselves, and some actually impose internal carbon taxes on their various business units. So it is increasingly clear that nothing is going to happen in this area if it doesn't involve private actors, including, most recently, I believe, investors. There has been a money gusher going into ESG mutual funds and exchange-traded funds. ESG means taking environmental, social, and governance criteria into account when making investment decisions. Globally, these funds now account for more than $26 trillion, or about a quarter of all assets under management. The US GDP, just to give you a sense, is about $20 trillion. Now, if you look at the growth of these funds, they first took off like a hockey stick graph after the 2008 financial collapse. And the hockey stick kept getting longer and longer after the election of Donald Trump. Go on the Morningstar website, you will actually see the hockey stick. The trend was led by institutional investors like pension funds that tend to have a longer time horizon, and I would guess began to realize that they can't ensure sustainable returns unless sustainability itself is ensured. Now, these funds include garden variety mutual funds and fund managers, and most recently, they've moved big time into private equity markets. So this dynamic of the public and the private, which we fully understand at the domestic level and have studied it for decades and decades, is in fact playing itself out transnationally as well. So let me just draw these remarks to a close. Theory of International Politics has nearly 19,000 Google Scholar citations. That is an extraordinary achievement in our discipline. Bob Jervis is nodding his head. It reflects the enormous impact that Ken had on the field, and it's well-deserved. At the end of the day, however, it's a relatively sparse theory about a subset of interstate relations, which is perfectly fine, except that so much of our discipline has treated it as being much more, as a theory of global politics and transformation or stability in general. That isn't Ken's fault, but it is a fact. So in the security realm, the essence of bipolarity, it got right. as well as what he called the dismaying persistence of balance of power politics generally. But it was focused on the statist form and dynamics of the post-World War II order, not its liberal rules-based content, as I said before. In the economic realm, it does much less well. There's very little in Waltz's formulation that would help us grasp the transformation of global markets and firms. He might point to President Trump's attempted trade wars as evidence for his argument, but if we look closely, we see that the system of global supply chains, to take that example, is very difficult to disentangle because it is so vast and so complex, and just trying to do so imposes significant costs on America's own businesses and consumers. Finally, as I said, what he described as the tyranny of small decisions has had a deleterious effect on the production of public goods. But I've also suggested that in the face of states not doing enough or heading in the wrong direction, the private power system is assuming a greater role in the attempt to protect its own long-term interests. So what's my takeaway? If we view today's international politics solely through the lens of interstate relations, then Waltz takes us quite a way. But if we view it through the lens of what we might call the broader world power system, he doesn't take us as far. The world power system, I have tried to suggest, has always been shaped by the domestic social purposes, the constitutional arrangements, the ideologies, prevailing norms, toward which a particular state's power is deployed. And agreement or dissension about those social purposes within or across major states is as much of a source of systemic instability today as interstate power changes. Second, I would have tried to suggest that a different type of expression of private power has become institutionalized at the global level, rooted in property rights. It was enabled by state policy choices, but it has created an international order of its own. And in some measure, that order balances the power of the state system just as states engage in balance of power politics vis-a-vis one another. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Well, I get the first question.
Okay.
It's a three-part question.
Uh-oh, that's three questions.
And it's really based on a comment. Then I'll make my comment, and then the question will be, what do you think of that? I always thought that Ken and maybe realists in general have gotten a bad rap for allegedly arguing that domestic politics and domestic determinants don't matter, when it seems to me his distinction between a theory of international politics and a theory of foreign policy takes full account of the frequent importance of domestic politics in affecting events in the international system. Is that not a fair way of salvaging his argument about the system? Secondly, yes, his theory is sparse, and he was the first to admit that. I forget exactly what the line is in the book, but it essentially says, this doesn't tell us very much. It's just that what it tells us is very important. And finally, I'd be inclined to agree with you that it's not as interesting in the economic realm as it is in the realm of War and Peace. And is it fair perhaps to say that we don't have a really first-rate unified theory, that liberal and constructivist theories really haven't had very much to say about military policy, which is the essence of the War and Peace dimension. So do we have very interesting, maybe powerful theories that are largely divided between the economic and the strategic realms?
Okay, how much time do we have? Thank you, Dick. In a descriptive way, it's almost impossible for anybody who writes about international affairs not to say something about domestic matters, domestic interests, corporate influence, authoritarian tendencies, what have you. That's common stuff. Waltz went out of his way to argue that there is an autonomous theory of international politics, autonomous from other realms such as the domestic. It turned out to be a sparse theory, and you're right in your quote that he said, this doesn't explain everything, but what it explains is important. And the interstate balance of power and what produces stability as a result of the interstate balance of power is an important subject. I would argue today, and I tried to suggest, that domestic divisions and polarization today in the world are as much a cause of international instability as the change in the interstate balance of power. But there's nothing that I see in Waltz that would include that in a theory of international politics. And that's fine. It was a choice he made. And as I said, my problem has been as much with others in the field reading much more into it and trying to sort of universalize it as a theory of everything international, which I think Ken was himself clear that he was not doing. But on the economic realm, one of the long-standing debates between Waltz and others was triggered by an article of his called "The Myth of International Interdependence," and it encapsulates the model that he had in his mind about what makes the world go round. Interdependence is measured by the relative size of domestic economic activity versus international. And it's true what he said, that in the post-war era, we didn't reach the same level of international economic activity as before World War I until the 1960s and 1970s. But given the emergence thereafter of using the entire world as a production platform and having intermediate goods trade, like, a small part is done in one country and then it's shipped to another country where it gets refined a little further and it gets shipped to a third country. And it's all within the ambit of a global production system. That's a very different notion of interdependence. And it was just a relatively narrow view on his part of how to define and measure interdependence. And as I say, it came along just as he finished theory, but his argument about international economic independence never changed. It was always a marginal affair. And it was more marginal when you had a small number of great powers with large domestic economies. Look at China. It's a very large country. It has a very large domestic economy. It's about as integrated into the global system of supply chains as you could possibly imagine. And there is nothing in the conceptual apparatus of theory of international politics that would help you account for that.
Floor is open. Don't all yell at once. Tom?
Yeah, thanks for coming, John. I wanted to press you in the same direction and ask you whether you would bridge the gap between Dick's world of international security politics and economics and state with confidence that the transnational production chain has been a major force for peace. The world's a lot more peaceful than it's ever been.
Is that a statement of fact, or is that a question?
It's a statement of fact that the world is more peaceful than it's ever been.
Yeah.
By a lot. And there's a transnational production chain that's new. Do you think those two things are related or not? And how would you try to go about showing that they were, if you do believe they're related?
That's a really good question. And when you say the world is more at peace, you mean there are fewer interstate wars?
Many fewer interstate wars, and there's less death by political violence than in any time in modern human history.
But one of the things I find interesting is that the major domestic political violence, or just violence period, tends to be concentrated in countries that have been left behind by the global supply chains. So there may be a relationship. I don't have proof of that.
It's hard to prove.
It's hard to prove.
But it seems really
Yeah.
important because what I'd press you is,
Yeah.
how important is the institutional structure in the international economic and political space that allowed for the transnational production chain and keeping it going? How at risk is that institutional structure at present? In part because of the actions of this country, but also reactions in the European Union, in individual countries of the European Union and elsewhere, and in China itself, which became more protectionist before the United States did. If all that's at risk, and the proposition is that one of the major causes of the reduction of interstate violence has been the transnational production chain, then you should be quite worried about that, not simply on economic grounds, but on security grounds. But I believe this. I say this in the classroom, but I always say I can't prove it because it's a giant counterfactual.
Yeah.
I do worry greatly if this unravels, that we're going to go, that stupid little problems like the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute between Japan and China might actually be causes for violence if there aren't huge economic consequences for that sort of violence.
Tom, I think you're right, but we got to be careful not to lump too many things together. So, I think Brexit is a really stupid move, but the pro-Brexit folks, at least in the Conservative Party, and Prime Minister May herself, has said that it will liberate Britain to be a better and more effective trading entity and financial entity with the global system than it is now, constrained by the European Union. So being pro-Brexit doesn't necessarily mean that you're against. And I think the same thing is true with some of the with some of the authoritarian tendencies in Europe. Whether it's Hungary or Poland, it's not the issue of not participating in the international economy that's driving that. It's other factors.
Jack?
John, I was wondering.
Hi, Jack.
Hi. I was wondering if you would like to try your hand at extending your argument about private power and state power in the overall power system to analyzing the dire dysfunctional state of the global marketplace of ideas and information. So is this a problem that has arisen because of something in the private dimension of global power? Is it something having to do with the abdication of states to regulate market relations? Is it an unraveling of something about the larger system of embedded liberalism? And what is the right place to look in terms of how to fix it? Should it be the actions of the private actors? Should it be the states stepping up to regulate?
Just before I came up here, I had a talk with Chris Stone, who was on his way to talk to people at Google about how they ought to be behaving with regard to some of these issues. A very general answer is that this is a revolution in technology that has come on us very sudden. All of us at the beginning, or many of us, thought it was a terrific thing. It would, not only do no evil, but build a community and so on and so forth. And it took us a while to figure out all of the adverse effects of this technology, and also including artificial intelligence and all the rest. Generally, over the course of history, it's taken society a while to adapt to major technological changes. But at the present time, our political systems, I think it's a gross generalization, but is particularly dysfunctional, and it may take us a while longer. And so, in the short run, you've got to try to fix the political system, but also to work directly with the players involved. Now, I think Google is fixable. I think Facebook is not, because of very different business models that they're built on. But there is no substitute in the long run for regulatory policy. And that requires some willingness on the part of the private actors, realizing that they're in a mess themselves, and the public institutions to do what public institutions are supposed to do, which is to govern in the public interest. That's the best I can do.
Thank you, Professor Ruggie. Enlightening speech. You introduced the idea, or not the idea, but you mentioned that the non-sovereign states, i.e. the corporations, the international corporations, are now into the international play. And we recently had a Secretary of State coming from that direction. To what extent does sovereign states use them as a soft power for projection?
Sure.
We have done it.
Sure.
The Russians have done it.
China does it, yeah.
China does it.
Yeah.
What's the development of that idea, and is it positive? Is it negative? Does it dilute power?
Whose power?
The state's power.
The state's power. No, I think the point that I was making about China, China has, they now have, I think it's 125 companies on the global Fortune 500. And many of those are state-owned, or even though they may be listed somewhere, it's a very small fraction that is in publicly traded domain. And obviously, China has used its multinational corporations as an instrument of influence outside the borders of China. Latin America, Africa in particular, neighboring countries in Asia. So that's not new. We've done that. We had something called gunship diplomacy when United Fruit. Somebody tried to nationalize United Fruit. They were threatened by the American state. That's not new. What is new is the fact that this institutional form of, let's call it global value chains or global supply chains, is universal. It has not only empirical power, but it has normative power. It's the way you conduct international business. It's the, you don't, there's no, Lamy, Monsieur Lamy had a wonderful quote, Merritt. I don't know if you saw it. He addressed an association of business leaders, and he said the WTO has no idea what's going on inside global supply chains. We need your help to figure it out. That's the World Trade Organization. It can't get into the into the plumbing, as it were, of a new global power system, even as states still continue to use whatever methods of influence projection they have, including through corporations, especially when they're state-owned.
Kim?
John, I'm Kim Martin from Barnard College. It's good to see you again.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm sorry I came in a little late. I'm wondering if you can give us a theory of change or of evolution. Because if you look at liberal theory, I mean, that was always the primary counterpart to realism at the time, certainly that Ken Waltz was doing most of his writing. And liberalism suggested that if China became integrated into global supply chains, that China would moderate itself, that it would become more of a good global player, so to speak, that it would take on global shepherding roles that were positive, and that it would go through a domestic evolution even towards liberal democracy because of that trade integration. And in fact, what we've seen, at least in what is becoming the medium term, I think a little bit longer than the short term, is that that's not happening. And so what does your perspective lead to? Once these global supply chains are in place, where does change come from, and what does it lead to in the long run?
Well, I never believed in that sort of liberal theory in the first place. I thought it was always wishful thinking. The idea that, and it was on the part of not only academics, but also political leaders. There's nothing in the history of China, which is a long and very important and proud history, that would suggest that they are going to integrate themselves into the liberal rules-based order and become just like us. So where does the theory of change come from? The theory of change comes from where I think theories of change have come from for forever. And I'm not a Marxist either, but it has to do with conflict between different groups, between different sectors, some of which we're witnessing today, and some of which plays itself out at the global level, and some of which remains domestic. I think we have far too long, in both liberal and realist theory, ignored the conflict among social groups as a driver of systemic outcomes. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of both bodies of theory. Now, I have sometimes claimed to have something to do with social constructivism, but I've never thought that social constructivism was a theory. It's an approach there's no Weberian theory. You can teach Weber in a theory class, but you can't reproduce a theory that you find in Weber's writings, except for the long-term trend toward rationalization. And that's because Weber was, in large measure, a social constructivist. He had an approach to the study of social change, but didn't have a theory of social change, except for that meta-hypothesis of rationalization and moving away from the gut stuff into the brain stuff, which in itself, if you were to use it as a theory, doesn't hold up. But class distinctions, if I can use that word as a non-Marxist, are really important. And we haven't had good theory from everybody's, not everybody, but people, intellectuals in our field who are sort of self-described radical theorists or whatever, they haven't read anything since Gramsci, much, at the international level, to use at the international level. We haven't encouraged that approach in our graduate schools. I can't speak for Barnard. I can't speak for anybody, for that matter. I barely speak for myself. Yeah, so my theory is that we have been over-theorizing, looking at too few factors that really affect social change, and which typically results from forms of social struggle.
Mr. Ruggie, could you reflect analytically on where you think the United Nations system is going? You observed the fact that its revenue base is flatlined. It's likely to even reduce its contributions are withdrawn, including from the US. It has no taxing powers, and philanthropies can only fill a certain part of the void that's left behind, and not all of it. The developing world depends on the United Nations system more than the first world does. And so it may well be that the countries that are left out of the supply chain network also undergoes stresses that may result in increasing forms of violence and conflict. And so where is the UN system going? Does it have a future?
It was 2 days ago that the Trump administration announced that it may withdraw from the Universal Postal Union.
Yes.
That was founded in 1874. And it coordinates literally the delivery of mail across borders. And he's going to replace America's membership in the Universal Postal Union with bilateral treaties. How many countries are in the world? 193 members of the UN. Right? So you've got 192 other countries you're going to do bilateral treaties with. It's madness. But it has an effect, obviously, on current US policy toward the UN. It's not a happy time for the UN. I was very happy to be at the UN when I was there, because my boss was Kofi Annan, one of the most incredible human beings. Sadly, went to his funeral in Accra about a month ago. But it was a special time. It was the end of the Cold War. Anything seemed possible, and you have this wonderful person at the head of the organization. The UN is, well, I'll give you an anecdote. One of the things that I did early on in Kofi Annan's administration was to lead a institutional reform effort. The British government decided to host informal discussion at Wilton Park in England. The ambassador, I was asked to give sort of the presentation of what the reform plan consisted of, and Kishore Mahbubani, who was then ambassador from Singapore, was the commentator. And so I gave my remarks, and then Kishore, when he started his comments, he said, let me get this right. I think what Professor Ruggie has just said is that the UN would be a wonderful place if it weren't for states. So the UN at the decision level, decision-making level today, in the Security Council or what have you, is not doing well. It is overwhelmed on the ground by refugee problems. And it is increasingly, because of the flatlining of the budget, is increasingly dependent on voluntary contributions by the Scandinavians, by the Dutch, occasionally by the Canadians. My personal view is that as a global decision-making body, the UN is currently marginalized, but it is extremely important still on the ground. And as long as we have funders who are willing to deal with humanitarian issues and the like, it continues to be a relevant institution.
How effective, so it's a little bit in line with the previous question, how effective do you think are some of the UN instruments to regulate sort of the business arena? So for example, the UN principles, guiding principles of business and human rights, or the children's rights and business principles that were done by UNICEF and the Global Compact. How effective do you think are these instruments in terms of regulating the private sector, and where's room for improvement?
Oh, there's room for improvement everywhere. But let me just, since you mentioned it, let me take the UN guiding principles for business and human rights as an example. I was dragooned into being the special representative of the Secretary General. He called me up when I was already at Harvard. I'd gone back to academics. And he said, John, I have this assignment. There's a real mess in Geneva. They're trying to develop a treaty, and no one is supporting it. This was in 2005, it was a long time ago. And he said, it's only a 2-year project maximum, and you can do it mostly desk-based. And then you're done. It took 6 years, 50 international consultations, endless. In the end, for the first time ever, the UN adopted a normative text that governments had not negotiated themselves. That gave it a certain authority that it wouldn't have had otherwise. So what did that authority mean? That meant that first it meant that other international organizations that are in this space aligned their own policies as much as possible. So the OECD immediately adopted the guiding principles as the human rights chapter of their guidelines. The International Finance Corporation incorporated them into performance requirements, and so on, the EU, of course, and so on and so forth. But then surprising things happened because it moved out of the realm of international institutions into national governments. That's fine. But then a few years later, in the middle of FIFA's corruption scandals, the then president of FIFA, under pressure from some of the sponsors to act not only on the corruption scandal, but also on labor rights issues, in Qatar, for example, where a World Cup was destined to be held, asked whether I would be willing to work with them to develop human rights principles, which are now incorporated into bidding requirements for future World Cups. So the most recent bids came from Morocco and from the countries formerly known as NAFTA. Okay? The king of Morocco had to issue a bunch of edicts related to human rights to be able to make a bid for the World Cup. They didn't make it. The US, Canada, and Mexico got a unified bid accepted. So it's hard to explain, but the International Bar Association issued guidelines for corporate lawyers as wise counselors based on the guiding principles. So they moved into all sorts of sectors that I would never have expected, although I ended up participating in some of them. How effective are they? In the absence of central rule, if I could write a treaty that would be enforced, I'd be happy to do it. In Geneva, I mentioned before that there is a treaty, an Ecuadorian-led treaty effort. They're in the 4th year, and they haven't moved an inch. So you have to find other ways to influence outcomes if the formal mechanisms that are available to you don't work. That's the long and the short of it. It's compared to what? You ask how effective are they? Compared to what? And much more needs to be done.
Tonya?
Tanya Putnam, I'm an associate professor of political science here. So your optimism around the prospects for private actors to essentially be the ones to make a difference in the near future is really interesting. And you talked about the fact that we're in a related party trade kind of situation. You also mentioned that there are about 50 countries out there that count as tax havens. And to the extent that that means that there's an awful lot of very large corporations that are paying very little revenue into a lot of states where they're actually operating.
Mhm.
Is that in tension with what you were saying?
Yeah.
Is there something
Yeah.
you worry about that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you say a bit more of the?
Look, everybody has multiple interests, right? So the investment community has an interest in sustainability for its own sake, not for the good of the planet necessarily, but for its own sake. But it also makes choices about other things that may be in conflict with their own long-term interests. But they're both there. So do I worry about tax havens? Yeah, sure. I really do.
I mean, if I can add one more turn to that. I mean, I think one specific thing to worry about is the fact that the prevalence of these tax havens means that it's very hard for democratic governments to basically have the revenue they need to function and provide social services. And so to the extent that's draining out in the absence of there being anything that looks like a global government, especially with the situation involving the UN that you're describing, I mean, I just think that's the thing that keeps me up at night about all of this.
Oh, gosh, there's so many other things. There are two countries in the world that could put a real dent into tax havens.
This is what I want to
The United States and the United Kingdom. So the UK, in its, who was it who said that they lost an empire and haven't found a role? The UK, in its belief that it needs to be a world center of finance, is totally tied in to, I would guess, at least half of those tax havens. And they could put a stop to it tomorrow. But it suits their interest not to. Many of the financial transactions that are booked in tax havens actually go through New York. And we could put a big dent in that. But for whatever reason, neither the UK nor the US has decided to do that. But if Larry Summers is getting upset with the hollowing out of the state because of low taxation, then there may be hope. Yeah.
I just pondering if you have a little more you could share around the fragility around the private ordering you're describing. Because we are in a moment where it looks like the changes are on the margin. They're not fundamental, but there is more bringing industry home, trying to shift the global incentives, increasing domestic content, various things that would be eroding that global supply chain or shifting it. And so what the systemic implications are by more fragility, and there's even talk of decoupling as a national strategy, so thinking about what kind of fragility that actually introduces geopolitically, I'd be very interested in your thinking.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about using the word fragility. It's fragile in particular because its nature isn't full, the nature of the problem isn't fully understood by political leaders. The idea of bringing industry back home, which industries are going to bring back home? Why aren't we talking about the impact of robotics on the future of the American workforce? Why are we talking about manufactured goods that Vietnam can produce at a much cheaper rate and will for the foreseeable future? And then there's lots more countries behind them. The Brexit debate and the debate in the United States has been so disheartening because it keeps looking to the past rather than to the future. I worry desperately about the impact of robotics because they could put us out of business. I mean, you and me, you know, I mean, real personal stuff. So it resonates with a certain part of the population, particularly people who live in deindustrialized areas. And American, as you know better than I, American trade adjustment assistance has never worked well because very few of our our major public policy areas work all that well, except maybe, you know, Medicare, Medicaid. So the people in the deindustrialized parts of the UK and the US, you know, responded to this argument of bringing jobs back home. On the whole, they tend to be elderly. So in some sense, if I can put it crudely, that's a problem that will solve itself. But in the meantime, I think we should be working much harder to look toward the future challenges rather than bringing manufacturing jobs back home. And invoking national security grounds for imposing steel tariffs on Canada, our harmless neighbor who takes in Americans who can't land in the United States because of 9/11 and have fun in Newfoundland or wherever it was.
Is there any American politician of consequence who will say that?
No. Not even if they are not running for re-election.
They still want to be loved.
Yes, my name is Tobias. I'd like to follow up on the question of change and how to account for it. So your talk is titled "The Balance of Global Public and Private Power," and I think in your talk you mentioned a couple of forces or mechanisms that drive that shift of that balance of power. Among them, technological advancements, and also you kind of told us a story of the states basically inviting this development or nurturing it, right? And I'm sure there must be many other driving forces. And so I was wondering whether you could reflect a bit more on that balance, of what that means, and in particular I would be interested to hear whether you think we can have a more general theory that actually accounts for that shift between public and private power in the international, and if yes, how such a theory would look like.
That's a really, really big challenge that you put out there. You know, we haven't really talked about. We've talked a lot about the balance of power among states. We have good literatures on, if you will, the balance of power of the private and the public sector domestically and in comparative contexts at the national level. but we really, there has been the most creative, thing that I ever read on this subject was a PhD thesis at MIT. It was written in 1960. And I can't remember his name. He was Kindleberger's student, Jagdish. And then he died in a car crash a few years later. Gosh, I can't remember his name. But anyway, yes, Stephen Heimer, yeah. I had no idea until I read that we had lumped, statistically speaking, foreign direct investment into capital flows in the past, as opposed to having a separate category for foreign direct investment. What was brilliant about Heimer's thesis was that it drew on theories of industrial organization as opposed to finance and capital flows, and said, now, what if we look at the world from an industrial organization point of view? And let's say these corporations that may have gone to the EU to get into the common market begin to think in global terms. How would they restructure the world? It was 1960. It was phenomenal. And Kindleberger wrote a foreword to the thesis, and it was really celebrated. And then, as I said, the guy died in a car crash not long thereafter. And I have not seen much literature built on that. I've tried to draw on some of it in my own thinking, but don't forget, I've been in the trenches for the last few years, not writing theory. And this has given me an occasion to begin to reflect again on what I used to be. But I think the idea of drawing on theories of industrial organization, and say, put yourself in the shoes of a CEO who understands this. What would you do? So that, I think, explains part of the momentum toward this global institutionalization of that power sphere. Now, what produces change from here on, we discussed a little bit before, is this generates conflicts. And between those who are left behind and those who benefit more than they should, and so on and so forth. And then the dynamics emerge out of those conflicts. What exactly emerges, I can't tell you. I don't know. I wish I did.
John, I came in a bit late, but let me ask you one very simple question.
Uh-oh.
The answer may not be simple, but the interaction between domestic policy and foreign policy that you are talking about, I'd like to think in terms of concrete examples. Take Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Take which?
TPP.
Yeah.
Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, it has a great deal of provisions for maybe over 200 or something, like with this, the initiative against Japan, you remember? Everything under the sun was put into it, which our lobbies wanted. So the domestic lobbies are interested in putting their concerns and their desires and objectives into TPP. So even though many of us argue that environment should be handled through special treaties, like Kyoto, Paris, Cancun, whatever, to put it into a trade treaty is absurd, because trade negotiators have no idea about the complexity of these problems. The same thing about labor rights. Who is against it except maybe China? China probably specializes in removing the fingernails of trade union leaders or packing them off to Mongolia. I don't know what they do with them. But leaving China out, This is a straightforward thing. Most people would want labor standards. The real question is whether you want them in TPP. Our domestic lobbyists want that, because whatever is happening, they want to shove in their own objectives. So our unions, which are concerned about competition from developing countries, they're shoving in wherever they can these things. And USTR, of course, has to oblige them, and it gets into those things. Now, this is domestic lobbying interacting with the design of an international institution or TPP. And I see that as a concrete example of the way in which domestic lobbying interacts with the design of the international system. So it seems to me that you need to, if you start thinking concretely and forget about supply chains, I mean, they're relevant for discussing things like what happens if you have tariffs on China and so on. It's done much of in relation to the kinds of issues you were discussing. But leaving that aside, it seems to me that we need to really think very concretely in terms of how domestic lobbying, particularly in this country, which is lobbying intensive, how that interacts with the design of foreign policy and international institutions. And it's very bad. Now, one more thing about 232, which is a national security legislation. Why does Trump like it? And none of our friends, like your friends and the younger Trudeau and the European Union, have really focused on the fact that if you invoke the national security argument under 232 on aluminum and steel, it's a laughable thing. But why does Trump want it that way? Because he could have used other instruments like 301, etc., or anti-dumping. Because this is something where he can actually tear up the world trading system in terms of the allocation of market shares according to market principles. It's not always that good, but that's the underlying notion. With 232, he's able to reward friends and punish non-friends. So that is his intention. Now, what do you friendly leaders in EU and younger Trudeau do? Instead of condemning this and saying this is really a fundamental attack on the trading system, they line up for exemptions. Is that leadership? No. But it seems to me that whether they're doing it because of domestic constraints, I don't know, or misconceptions, or they haven't thought about the issue, but it is another case where domestic concerns and domestic lobbying and all sorts of things affect the design of the international trading system, which is whether you call it liberal or otherwise. And I think that is something whenever I think about what's going on in the international trading system and domestic lobbying in different countries, this is the way I think about it more concretely. And I think you're absolutely right that the two are interconnected. And if that's what you're pushing for, it is very clearly the case right now. And I think we are in real danger of the system collapsing because of lack of leadership, but not by Trump, because Trump is a kind of rogue leader on these issues. But it's because the rest of the world is not acting up so as to understanding the issues involved. And in it, as Harry Johnson, our common friend, used to say, like a fellow Canadian, it's the what's in it for me kind of mentality. And that's what we're facing right now.
Were you going to say something? No.
Hey, can I ask you a question before the students leave of John?
Yeah.
Which is, given everything you said about the limited role of the state, the limited role of the UN, the complexity of the international economy, the difficulty in finding solutions to complex problems, what would you say to a second-year SEPA student who wants to make a difference in the world? Where should that student direct his or her incredible intelligence and energies to make an impact, given all the things you said about the way the world's changed since 1970?
What I would say to them is that you've never had it so good. look at all the options you have where you can make a difference.
It
doesn't matter.
We need guidance from a wise guy like you.
It doesn't matter. You can make a difference through so many more channels today than in the past. In the past, you know, a generation ago, SEPA students went to work for the State Department. Yeah.
Would you advise them to do that now?
Um,
Foreign service officer or a UN civilian, you know, not associated with a country representation?
The UN on the ground, not in headquarters, but yeah. So on the ground, you can make a difference. In the State Department, not so much in this administration, but in the long term, yes. You know, I've had students at the Kennedy School who've gone to work for Coca-Cola, and a week later was sent to Colombia to work on child labor issues. So there are many ways, and the channels there are many more channels today than in the past. So that's what I mean by you've never had it so good. And look at all the challenges. Look at everything you can solve. Jagdish, I think we need to deal with your comments at dinner. But just one quick response. 232, it can't be challenged. Yeah, it can't be challenged under the WTO. So it's obvious that, you know, he would do that. And he doesn't like the WTO. He doesn't like multilateral institutions of any kind. He's withdrawing from the Universal Postal Union. 1874, Jagdish, 1874.
This is not news to me because in the field of international trade, this has been an eyesore for years and years. And
But the other thing I wanted to
doing
say,
something about it because he's focused on China. And China gets a lot out of it. He doesn't care if other people are concerned. You know, looks after the process.
but I think you mentioned corporate lobbying at the domestic level for the TPP, but it also was lobbying by labor unions. It was lobbying by human rights organizations. It was lobbying across the board, and the reason that was so is because this was you can look at it as simply a trade agreement. You can look at it as a way to try to contain China, but you can also look at it as a way of trying to constitutionalize things at the global level. And the TPP, given the diversity of interests, if you think about it as a constitutionalization at the global level, it's no longer a trade treaty. Okay, yeah, after wine.
This is really interesting. So, sort of a practical question. I know all the worst case scenarios, but best case scenario, how can this dual system of power deal with questions like the environment, or the environment specifically? What is the best case scenario for this system to actually do something about it?
The best case scenario is that the initiatives in and of themselves will make a difference, but even more important, they may generate enough of political momentum that governments themselves start stepping up and doing these things. That's the best case. You said you didn't say the most plausible. You said the best case, right?
Well, do you have any parting words of wisdom?
Wisdom? That's hard to come by, Dick.
We got another question.
Oh, we got another question.
Jack.
This could spur words of wisdom. There's a debate among liberals about what to do about the so-called crisis of the liberal international order. And some liberals have read your work on embedded liberalism, and we say, let's go back to John Ruggie's future. and reconstitute the welfare state and reinvigorate the Bretton Woods principles. It worked then, it'll work in the future. But you tonight said we can't look to the past to solve our new problems. Now, does that mean we can stick to your old principles, but just reinterpret their concrete meaning? Or does that mean we need to look for something completely different to solve the problem of the liberal order in the future? And so what does that look like?
Well, the principles would have to be reconstituted globally. I mean, the original embedded liberalism compromise assumed a world of disjoint and separate states engaged in external transactions that could be mediated at the border. We're not in that world. So the underlying principles may have relevance at the global level, but they would have to be completely reconstituted. I'm writing a chapter for a book that Katzenstein's editing on this subject, but I don't know yet what I'm going to say.
Well, thank you.